The title of this presentation is Security Sector Transformation, but I'm going to discuss both security sector transformation and security sector reform. I'll offer a distinction between the two during the presentation, but for the most part I'll use the terms interchangeably, and then when I talk about them differently I'll try to point it out and say it's transformation versus reform. One of the objectives was that Dr. Matt pointed out. He talked about this paradigm shift. And it's interesting because I think we're already there. I know in the discussions in my small group and what I've heard this week, I think that there's an acceptance already that there's no longer this traditional focus on the security forces. I think people have accepted that it's shifted now, and we have to include the human security element as well when we talk about the security sector. And if you read the syllabus and looked at the recommended readings, one of them was the AU framework document on security sector reform, which I hope to reference a couple times during the presentation today. But in that AU framework document, it talks very much so about the human security dimension of the security sector. So I think that paradigm shift has moved on, and we're there. So now the challenge is just how do we go about implementing? How do we do the hard part? Having been here now for 6 days, listening to all the presentations and the back and forth, everything you're going to see on the next few slides on the screen will just be a review. And in fact, as I heard a lot of the presentations and the discussions and the brief backs, is almost everything that I'm going to say has been covered. So I could almost just sit down and take questions, but I won't do that. So what you will see is some of the slides will look similar, some of the information will look similar, but hopefully what we'll do in the next few minutes is try to establish some points of reference on security sector reform and transformation, why we need security sector reform and transformation, look at some of the key actors, and then I want to try to spur debate on the how. So this presentation will not give you a blueprint or a step-by-step on how to do security sector transformation and reform, but rather just try to get us thinking about it and get debate among ourselves, because the real experts on this are you all in front of me. It's not me. So you live and work this every day in your job. And I think it's only fitting that Dr. Matt is the moderator for me, because he works security sector transformation reform every day in his job in Côte d'Ivoire, and he has a wealth of experience. And part of what we'll talk about on the next couple slides is the importance of oversight. So I really think that's why they ask him to moderate, is to provide the oversight for me. So if I step out of line or say something that's not right, he'll be able to correct me during the question and answer session. So thank you for the oversight for this presentation. Okay, let's see if I can work this thing here. Okay, if you hearken back to last week, the slide will look a little bit familiar. I've made a couple small changes in it from the way it was presented, I think, actually when Dr. Matt threw this slide up. It's slightly different, and what I did when I played with the slide a little bit is I put the security sector box up top, and then I put the civil society and the state oversight underneath it. And that's to show really that that's the underpinning and the accountability aspect of the security sector. So you have your providers of security in that top box, and then you have the underpinnings for the security sector underneath through what I labeled, or what's been labeled, civil society and state oversight. And if you look at the providers of security, and you think about security in the human dimension, there's a need for security among the people. And if it's not provided by the state, society is going to figure it out. I mean, lawlessness and chaos really don't rule within society. So if the state doesn't provide it and there's a void created, something's going to fill that void. And so really it's up to the state to decide how they're going to provide security, knowing that if they don't, somebody will. And if you look at the last line in there, it says private security and then / non-state actors. And if you remember back to the very first day when our director, Kate Almquist-Knopf, gave a presentation, she talked about where were the most violent places on the continent. She showed the map. And when I've heard her give this presentation before, she does a course which we call Africa 101, which is for people in the U.S. government who are fairly new to Africa or policy issues. And so we try to give an overarching view of some of the challenges and some historical context. And she'll ask that question and say, what's the most violent place on Africa? And people will say, oh, it has to be Libya, or it has to be Somalia, or northern Nigeria, whatever. And if you remember, her slide showed that it was South Africa, and it was in Southern Africa. And if you look at South Africa, the private security industry there is huge. So it's filled a void within the security sector that must be met by the people. Within South Africa, there's a company called Protea Coin, which does cash in transit. And there are 17,000 licensed security officers that work for that company. There's another company called Fidelity Corporate Services, which is the largest private security company in South Africa. And just internally, they have 26,000 licensed security officers. As a reference point, and the Admiral can correct me if I'm wrong, but the entire defense force of Senegal is about 20,000, I think. Now we're talking 26,000 security officers from one company. And it's a $6 billion a year industry in South Africa. And we think about South Africa as one of the most developed, and it is the most developed country as far as institutions and processes and, rule of law. You think about that, but there's a void there, and the void gets filled. And now think about non-state actors. Think about Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and why did they gain traction? And I don't want to oversimplify this. Obviously, there's a lot of reasons, and you could write a doctoral dissertation on it. But one aspect of it was they were providing a need within the rule of law and within the security sector, and they were filling a void that wasn't there from the government. And I think back to when I was in Afghanistan. It's the same way. Part of the Taliban's base level of support was providing and filling that void that wasn't there in the security sector from the government. Okay, so I mentioned in the beginning what's the difference between security sector reform and transformation. So I'll throw out the obligatory definitions and let you look through those. But I think sometimes there's a common perception on security sector reform that it's this starting all over, building from the ground up, that we're going to recreate a new military. And you think about the situation in Liberia and what happened there, or what's happening now in Somalia, and you're recreating this entire security sector, and people think that's security sector reform. And if you look at the second definition, you see security sector transformation is the complex task. Well, that's interesting, because I'll ask you, what do you think is harder, security sector transformation or security sector reform? And I would argue that it's probably security sector reform. And here's why. It's hard to reform and make substantive change in the security sector while you're already providing security for the populace. And there's an analogy that I heard a long time ago, and again, hopefully this translates well. But there's a man driving down the road with a truck. And in the back, the truck is full of cages of chickens, and it's stacked up 3 times higher than the truck, just full of chickens. And there's a man leaning out the side window on the other side with a stick, and he's just banging the side of the truck, so the chickens are flying all over the place. So there's a man driving down the road following the truck, and they finally stop, and he pulls up. He says, "What are you doing banging that cage?" He says, "Well, my truck is only rated for 500 pounds, but I have 1,000 pounds of chickens in the back, so I have to keep them up in the air so they don't max out the capacity of the truck." And that's kind of similar to security sector reform versus transformation. When I was in Afghanistan and we trained the Afghan police, what we did, and this may shock you or may not, we would go into a district and we'd pull out the entire police force and take them for training. Because what we found is the vast majority of them had never had any training at all. They were just stepped into that role and they became a policeman, or really, in a lot of cases, they became a predator. And their skill sets were manning checkpoints and shaking down vehicles. And so to try to do training, we could train new recruits. But that didn't help, because you train these new recruits and you'd send them out into this dysfunctional police force, and then immediately, when a new guy comes in an organization, what's he do? They adapt to what the old guys do. So what we found we had to do to make change was to pull the entire district police force out and train them. And you could do that in Afghanistan because, one, they weren't providing much security, so I think for the people it was really a respite more than anything else. But think about that now in, say, Nairobi. And you take one neighborhood within Nairobi and you say, okay, I'm going to pull all the policemen out and take them for training. Or here, where we are in Arlington, Virginia, and for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, however long, we just take all the policemen out. You can't do it. It can't be done. So security sector reform, I would argue, is probably a little bit tougher than security sector transformation. So why do we have to do security sector reform? And we have to ask that question is the why. And it usually comes from 2 things. One is insecurity, The second one is inefficiency, and frequently it's both. So when I say insecurity, what we're talking about is trying to address the threats of today. And inefficiency, I view as trying to address the challenges of tomorrow. And again, that's why I think security sector reform is a little tougher, because for security sector transformation, you're trying to solve a problem for today, and so everyone's focused on it. But trying to look ahead to the future and trying to organize your security sector to handle the challenges for the future and trying to figure out what the second and third order effects for some of these challenges are, it's tough and it's hard. And that's why you need a strategic plan to make this work. And so it's a little bit tougher to do. Did that change? Am I on the right slide? I've kind of lost. Let me look over here. Sorry, Fred, for this. Were we on the basic elements? I can't see. No. Let me try to go back again. Okay. Okay. We good? Okay, so if you look at what are the basic elements of security sector reform and security sector transformation, and if you look at the front where it talks about, or the first bullet where it talks about allegiance to the state rather than to leaders, regimes, or parties. And I think this really comes down to legitimacy. And legitimacy is the prerequisite for security sector reform and transformation. You can do all the reform and changing that you want, but if you don't have legitimacy in the eyes of the people of the government, it's not going to be effective and it won't hold. And a lot of times, there's a lot of talk about having militaries that are apolitical or not involved in politics or civilian control of the military. And of course, those are sound principles. However, if the civilian control is an authoritarian regime, or it's a regime that doesn't respect the rights of the people, or that regime creates some of these human security challenges and the security sector is part of the problem, just because you have an apolitical security sector or a security sector that has civilian oversight doesn't mean that it's a good security force that's going to meet the criteria for being effectively providing human security or state security. So first and foremost, you have to have legitimacy as a prerequisite. The next 2 points are related, where we talk about force structure and doctrine must reflect the country's needs and interests, and then a force size constrained by the government's ability to pay salaries. This comes down to what we talked about in the previous session on the briefbacks and what we've mentioned several times, which is the importance of a national security strategy. Remember, a strategy lays out what you're trying to achieve, what are the ends, but then you have to align the ways and means against it. And you see the bullet that says must be tied to financial ministry reforms. That's key. You can't develop a strategy. As I mentioned earlier, a vision without resources is a nightmare. It's the same thing. A strategy without resources is just a piece of paper. Okay, it's ineffective. So you have to have the means to be able to do it. And I'll add one more thing on here when it comes to means. And this is a little off the norm. But a lot of times we forget that the security sector has to buy in to this idea of security sector reform. And they have to be part of the process. So you can say it's imposed from above and the government decides and they have the strategy. But if you're fighting and you have resistance from the security forces, it's not going to take. So you have to see, okay, why is it important to them? What is their advantage? They need to buy in and be part of the process. They need to see why it's important, the advantages. And part of that is resources. If they see, if the security sector and the security forces see that they're getting the resources, that they're being paid, they know they're going to have a pension when they retire, they have the proper equipment, they know they're ready when they go out, they value that and they buy in. And now they're part of the process on security sector reform. If you don't have those resources, you're not going to be effective. So that is even more important than strategy is the resources to implement the strategy. We talked in our group yesterday about the merit-based promotions in a security force and how do you get the right balance between merit versus the right ethnic mix or gender representation, and it's tough. But I tell you, if within a security force, if it's not merit-based or you're not moving towards a merit-based system, and then you lose that legitimacy within the force. So it's a basic element of the security sector reform and transformation. Lastly, foreign templates, doctrine, design, etc. Common. Think about the example I brought up earlier about Liberia. How did Liberia's security sector transformation effort work? For the most part, it was a U.S.-led effort funded by our State Department, contracted out to a company, and people came in, and granted they worked with the Liberians and they worked with Ministry of Defense and they had the plan. So I'm not saying it was totally imposed and they worked the U.S. solution, but it's pretty much led and run from the outside with a foreign template. I think about what's happening in Somalia right now. A couple weeks ago, I was talking with a brigadier general from New Zealand who works for the UN in Somalia, and his job is to try to coordinate all the international efforts that are going on in Somalia to bring about this security sector transformation, build the army, integrate the different agencies. And it's a tough job. But in all that, what he's doing is he's integrating what Turkey's doing, what the Emirates are doing, what the U.S. is doing, what everybody's bringing into the equation. And what Somalia wants, who knows? Because they come in with a plan, but they're influenced as well, and they have different interests and actors working behind the scenes. And so it's really tough to figure that out. So if you look at the role of the foreign actors, and I mentioned earlier that the AU framework document. Let me read you a quote from that. If you haven't read that document, take the time to do it. It's really good. I think the AU, they get it in principle, and that document lays out a lot of great principles. But in it says, security reform processes have been mostly informed by externally generated policy frameworks and assumptions that often do not necessarily align with the realities and sources of insecurity of African peoples, states, and societies. Okay, so that's an acknowledgement right out of that framework document that the AU wrote. And the other thing with these external templates or influence on the SSR, SST process is most foreign actors come in with a defense-centric approach. They come in and they want to reform the military. And it starts, if you're building again, it starts with DDR, and they look at, okay, how do we get the Army right? And then maybe they'll talk about the Navy, maybe the Air Force, depending on the country. But it's very much defense force-centric. But as we've been discussing here for the last 6 days is security sector needs to get away from a defense force-centric model and look at human security. So obviously part of that is the state security and the borders. But if you look at what's happening on the continent and you look at the threats and the challenges, most of them are internal type operations. If you look at what's happening in Boko Haram, you look at what happened in the Central African Republic, you look at Mali and these other examples, what really has to happen there is the rule of law needs to be strengthened and the internal security situation needs to be improved. And the starting point for that frequently is not the defense forces. But yet when the external actors come in, that's usually their coming in position is they're defense force centric. Okay, so the good news on this. The good news is that there's some lessons learned in Africa on some trends in security sector reform and transformation. And my colleague, Tom Dempsey, who I think you met on the first day or maybe not. I know unfortunately, Tom, who put this course together and helped write the curriculum and organize it, was taken ill and is unable to be here this week. But he frequently gives this presentation. And when he comes to this slide, he gets really excited. And he says, Africans have figured this out. I mean, they've gone through and they know that, you know, the peace operations are taking over more of a mission from conventional force. They understand the rule of law and justice. And he gets really emotional about this slide, which is great. It's passionate, and I agree with everything he says. But the other side of that is understanding it and implementing it are two different things. And I'll tell you an example. One time I was in rural Malawi, very rural Malawi, and I was traveling with my two sons at the time who I think were 10 and 12 years old. And we were trying to get to a place called Rumpi, out in the middle of nowhere, and there was this small nature conservancy there where they had some leopards and other things that my boys wanted to see. I was up there and was interfacing with the Malawian army, so we drove up. So I'm driving for hours and hours where I think I'm going, and finally it's just nothing's looking right. I'm on dirt roads, and so I finally see a man walking beside the road, and I say, is this the road to Rumpi? And he looks at me and he says, no, my friend, you are lost. And then he kept walking. And why do I say that story? One, because I think it's funny, and my sons remind me of it all the time, you know, that dad got lost. But the other side of it is, here's this man in as rural Malawi as you can get. And I could have handed him a package and a book and said, hey, look, here's how you can go to New York. Here's the hotel you should stay in. These are the flights I recommend you take. Restaurants, while you're there, I want you to go to this show on Broadway. You're going to have a great time. It's all organized. I have it tabbed. I have a table. I say, here you go. Enjoy your time in New York. That man's never gone to New York, okay? If I'd given him a plane ticket, I'd given him, $10,000 and other things, he may be able to go. But this nice, neat, organized plan was never going to get him to New York. And it's kind of the same thing on security sector reform and transformation. I think we know a lot about what needs to be done, but the hard part is getting the resources and the plan to implement it. Okay, rule of law. I think we've been talking about rule of law all week, and there's consensus on the importance of rule of law. And absolutely, it is the key to security sector reform and transformation. And I'll give you an example from the U.S. history, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the United States, the minority population was oppressed, for lack of a better word, by the security forces in a lot of areas of the country, by the police and by other actors. And there was this ingrained sense among certain portions of the population that the minority population was inferior or didn't warrant the same rights, or they could be treated differently. And to try to bring about that transformation from the ground up and within the police forces, it wasn't going to happen. It had been almost 100 years since the end of our Civil War, which was fought over slavery, 99 years before this legislation was passed. It wasn't happening. So what had to happen was the state had to act, they had to pass legislation and force it and impose it upon the security sector to make sure that there was equal protections of human security for all the people. So that's the rule of law, and that's the way these framework documents work. More on this intersection of rule of law and the security sector. You see the word impunity or no impunity on there. It's critical to get the support of the populace. We talked about this in our group yesterday for quite some time about the role of the civilians and the citizenry within an effective security sector and making sure they have the respect and the understanding of what they do. And impunity is a part of that. Every security force has bad actors. And I think about my time in Afghanistan, we had some soldiers who went out and murdered some civilians. And I know there's been allegations of abuse in northern Nigeria against Boko Haram. You read about peacekeepers from France committing acts of atrocity in certain areas. It happens in every organization. But what needs to happen next is the important part, and that's where you get at impunity. It's the investigation process. It's the rule of law. It's making sure that people are held accountable for their actions and that the populace sees the state taking action on that. That's what makes the difference, and that's what has to happen in this. I often, when I give these presentations, and sometimes people will come up and say, well, it sounds like Africa's got all these problems, particularly when I'm talking to the U.S. audience, particularly in that beginners or the introductory course we give. And what I like to say is none of these are African problems. These are international problems. We just like to talk about them in an African context. But probably right now as I'm speaking, there's someone in some forum somewhere talking to a group of people from South America and they're talking about the same issues. Or there's someone in Colorado talking about issues in our border area in the United States. These issues are universal. And so some of the, not some of them, but all the fundamentals to correct them are the same across the board, and it starts with the rule of law. Okay, establishing norms for accountable security forces. I will ask you a question, and I'll answer it. I don't need anybody to call out. But do you think security sector reform and transformation is top-down, is it bottom-up, or is it a mix of both? I would argue it's top-down. And if every organization that you work with, for the most part, okay, I'll say every organization is a learning organization and they want to get better. And when you get someone in the job as they're a boss or a supervisor or even a new employee, they want to learn their job and they want to get well. So organizations change and they make improvements. And that certainly happens within the police forces and in the military and all aspects of the security sector. But that's not reform and transformation. Reform and transformation has to start at the top. Because no organization is static, and it begins with the rule of law, and it begins with these framework documents that establish what the norms are and what the expectations are for how the security sector is going to operate. Okay, if we look at some of these framework documents, and we talked about many of them in the course of our presentations, we talked about police acts and national defense acts, and I mentioned the Civil Rights Act in the U.S. and different legislations. And you'll see on here the talk of a constitution. And I say that with a little bit of trepidation because constitutions are viewed differently. There's this conventional wisdom or common thought that the Constitution's this framework document that begins and ends all conversations on what the framework is for the security sector. And I tell you, it's different depending on where you're at in the perspective. And what I mean by that is, if the Constitution doesn't have the respect and the legitimacy of the people, then it's not a valid framework document. Frequently, constitutions are viewed as political tools. And in a lot of states, if the ruling party has an overwhelming majority in Parliament, it's easy to change a constitution, and the people see that. So they don't necessarily view a constitution as that overarching document that provides impunity from the security forces, that compels the security sector to act within certain norms. And I'll give you an example is, well, our Constitution, I think, has that. And so you have arguments all the time about people's rights. And if you stop a normal American on the street, they'll be able to tell you several aspects of the Constitution, how it applies to them, and what their rights are. And it's kind of an overarching framework document. And our Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, they use our Constitution as their guiding principle on making decisions. But in the United Kingdom, which is another, I would say, stable country and not a lot of internal problems on issues, they don't have a Constitution. And so if you look at what the UK's constitution is, you'll get a definition of it's an informal collection of, law codes or past civil case. And so they lump it all together and they kind of refer to it as a constitution, but there's no physical document that you can hold and read and say this is the Constitution. So why do I say all that? I'm not saying the constitutions aren't important. They are important. What I'm saying is that the legal framework documents that the security sector is based upon have to be valid and they have to be legitimate in order to be effective.